Good evening. I'm Rich Shriver, a member of the Board of Directors of Watershed Fund. We're here with the Old Lyme Conservation Commission and Estuary magazine at the Phoebe Griffin Noyes Library in Old Lyme. And we would all like to thank you for joining us for the third of hopefully many more quarterly Connecticut River watershed seminars. These seminars are for anyone interested in the environment, focusing on the past, present, and future of the Connecticut River watershed from the northern reaches of New Hampshire and Vermont, flowing 410 miles south to Old Saybrook and Long Island Sound, and the issues the watershed faces. The seminars are given by experts in their fields, providing in-depth, accessible, and timely exploration of the river's history, terrestrial habitats, aquatic habitats, invasive plants, planned for or fish habitats. Seminars are open to the public, and your registration for the seminar tonight will also include registration for future seminars. A recording of seminars is also available for public access. You will be provided a link to the recording in the coming days. Our seminars are available on YouTube. With time permitting, we may be able to entertain some questions and answers. So welcome and thank you for your interest in an important natural resource. We try to cover many of the salient issues of the watershed between the covers of Estuary magazine and are always interested in hearing how we can better serve our community. Now, I would like to introduce Dan Jaff Wilder. Dan is an ecologist, horticulturist, a botanist with over 15 years experience working with native plants and their associated ecology. His work has ranged from classrooms to nurseries to botanical gardens to wildlife refuges, specializing in native plant ecology, propagation, wildlife habitat construction, and native edible landscapes. Dan is currently the Director of Applied Ecology at Norcross Wildlife Foundation, whose mission is to protect, enhance, and expand wildlife through conservation, education, and support. A prolific photographer and author, Dan's book, Native Plants for New England Gardens, was released in 2018. Dan Jaff Wilder, Building Resilient Habitats.
Thank you so much. Let me get the slides up and running and we'll get right into this. You should be seeing that at this point. Please let me know if you're not. So today is, as was mentioned, Building Resilient Habitats. Let's just dig right into this. We got all sorts of good stuff to talk about. First off, as was mentioned, I work for Norcross Wildlife Foundation. For anyone unfamiliar with us, you can find more about us on our website. We are a wildlife foundation based in South Central Mass, North Central Connecticut. We steward about 8,000 acres, a little bit more. We do all sorts of fun stuff, mostly focusing on wildlife habitat, facilitation, construction, protection, and a whole lot of education. If you want to know more about some of the things we've got going on, check out our autumn and winter seminar series. You can find a little bit of details of that here on the side and more information on our website.
Okay.
Digging into this, what I'm going to talk about today is perhaps a little bit different from the previous parts of this seminar series. I'm going to focus a bit on what we do on our home landscapes because, as I'm sure pretty much everyone in this audience is probably very familiar with, the actions we take at home have broad effects regionally, especially when you start living and working in a watershed. Your effects get run down the road, run into the stream, run into the river. Things tend to kind of balloon from our own home landscapes. And that's where I want to kind of focus today. What are we doing at home and how is that affecting the broader community? So we're going to talk about that in a series of different manners today. I could go on about this stuff for the next 12 hours. I don't think anyone wants to hear that, so we're going to try and do this in 1 hour. We're going to talk about native plants. It's where it all started for me, and when it comes down to it, if you want to know you're doing good in the landscape, plant native plants. You can kind of keep it as simple as that if you want to, or you can get much more complicated. It's really up to you at that point. The classic home gardener issue is weeds. I want to talk about dealing with weeds. I take a very different stance on it than I think most people, and I want to kind of encourage you to grow native species, including many of which that we might initially think of as a weed, but have broad habitat value in the landscape. I don't think I have a lecture these days that doesn't involve me telling people to one extent or another to kill their lawns. Lawns are kind of an awful thing to do to the landscape. There's a lot of issues associated with them, and we're going to dig into them at least a little bit. I want to introduce you to native species that thrive in any, don't call me on it, most landscapes. I'll provide you with a list of species that'll be available after today's lecture. And it's got all of the plants that frankly just do well on the landscape for us and build habitat kind of without us having to really think hard about it. We're going to talk about cleaning up gardens. My initial kind of entrance to ecology and native plants and all this was on landscape crews. I did a lot of garden cleanups. Honestly, what I did was generally counterproductive. I didn't know any better at the time, and I find that, as I learned more, I found that my options opened up. I want to share that. So, I hate to start off in a kind of negative light, but this is the doom and gloom section of today's lecture. Things aren't going so well out there these days. We are looking at some pretty drastic declines in some of the really important kind of groups of living organisms on the planet. Huge declines in insects, which is also a part of the huge decline in birds that we are seeing. Keep in mind that a large portion of our native birds' diets are the insects in the region, so these two are intricately connected. We're seeing vertebrate species going extinct in the past 50 years. This is the sort of thing that doesn't kind of occur without reason. Habitat loss is a major driver of these kind of challenges. And we lose a lot of forest land every single year, predominantly to development. I'm a Massachusetts guy, so I tend to work with a lot of Massachusetts numbers. These numbers are actually a bit out of date. I haven't found any recent ones, but they work for some previous 5 years ago. We lost 25,000 acres to development in the past 5 years. I'm not that, well, I don't love that number, but it's not the 25,000 that bothers me. It's those 9,300 acres of high priority conservation land. I don't think it would be realistic for me to make the statement that we should stop developing the landscape. As much as that might be a dream, it's not a realistic dream. It's not something that is actually approachable in the modern world that we live in. But if we are going to continue developing the landscape, developing in a smart and ecologically sensitive manner makes a lot of sense to me. And that's why those 9,300 acres of high priority conservation land they don't sit well with me. That's not the landscapes that we should be developing. Those are the landscapes that we should be working to protect. So, with all this doom and gloom, what can the average homeowner do about this? There's kind of two ways to go about this. First off, support your regional land conservation. Support your local land trust. My local land trust is Opacum Land Trust. I like them dearly. If you don't know who to support, feel free to throw some money at them. But you've probably got a local land trust to you. Get to know them. Get to know other local conservation groups, whether it be folks like the Trustees of Reservations or Audubon Society or Estuary. Get to know the groups that are doing the bigger, broader work than any one individual can take on their own. In terms of the individuals, build local habitat. This is not nearly as complicated as it might sound. It's as simple as planting native plants. If you plant the spice bush that you see in that bottom picture, there's a decent chance you're going to find spice bush swallowtails. It's not rocket science. We can make it really complicated, and sometimes we can really dig into it. If you want the sundial lupin, or if you plant the sundial lupin, you might be looking for the blue corner butterfly or the regal fritillary, which needs violets. There's a lot of these distinct connections that we could really dig into. We can also keep it simple. Plant native plants. Keep it as simple as that. You don't need to know the details. If you're planting native plants in your landscape, you are helping to build habitat locally. It's a great thing that any one of us can do. So let's kind of dig into that a little bit more deeply. This is a story of two different geraniums. On the left, we've got the common garden geranium. This is a non-native species. It's what we might refer to as a bedding annual. Common species that you'll find in just about any nursery in the region. On the right side, we have a native plant. That's the wild geranium. It's a true geranium. You can tell by the name Geranium maculatum, our botanical Latin there. And the major difference between these two plants, they're not really related, but they've got a similar name, and one of them on the right is native, one of them on the left is non-native. Let's see what they do. Both of them will easily be visited by the European honeybee. This is a European species. This is the one that people keep in order to make honey. This is not a native species. This is a generalist. It will feed on just about anything that looks like a flower, and it will happily feed on either one of these plants. This is a native guy. This is Bombus impatiens. This is probably the most common bumblebee in our region, one of easily the most common bees in our region. If you know nothing about bumblebees, which I'm one of them, and I see something, fuzzy and yellow and black fly by me, I point and say, Bombus impatiens, and I'm right half of the time. This is a very common species. Also a generalist, happy to feed on either one of the species. Unfortunately, that's kind of where the value of the non-native geranium ends. It feeds two generalist species, one of which isn't native. You will never find mining bees on it. Mining bees are specialized. They tend to have specific needs, and they're not going to show up on non-native species. You will not find the noble sun moth, whose caterpillar eats the leaves, the white-lined sphinx moth, the purple-lined sun moth, the white-marked tussock moth, or all of these other species that we can find on this native geranium, including, you'll notice at the bottom, 27 different species of butterflies and moths. This is the power of native plants. And notice I'm not telling you not to plant the bedding geranium on the left. If it was an invasive species, I might get on your case about it. It's not really causing any harm. We can maybe make the argument it's taking up space that could be better used. But if you like that garden geranium, plant the garden geranium. Plant the native geranium as well. Have the best of both worlds. This isn't about so much about what not to do. It's more about what to do. And I don't see a need to be a true purist in this. Plant the species that make you happy. Avoid the invasive species. Make sure the dominant part of your home landscape is filled with native species. So let's look at it from another angle. I like hummingbirds. They're a pretty good example. I've yet to meet someone who doesn't like hummingbirds, and they follow certain patterns. Hummingbirds like generally red and long tubular flowers. You notice the long nectar tube on that Lobelia cardinalis. That's our native cardinal flower. So it's classic. You plant this, cardinal flower, you tend to see hummingbirds. Here's a hummingbird. This is Lonicera sempervirens, our native trumpet honeysuckle. Again, long, red, tubular flower. Pretty easy to see this pattern. That's Monarda didyma, scarlet bee balm. Long, red, tubular flower. Everything fits. Some connections are a little less direct, though. Anyone want to take a guess as to who is benefiting from cinnamon fern? This is a fern. This is not producing a flower. It doesn't even produce seeds. It produces spores. Notice all the white hairs covering that? The hummingbirds will collect them. They use them to line their nests. They don't need cinnamon fern specifically, but they really do love it. They'll also collect poplar fluff, cattail fluff. This is one of these kind of indirect connections that we find between native species, native plant species in the broader ecosystem. And this is why you can keep it simple and just say plant native plants and know that you're doing some pretty good, you're doing good in the area. There's, kind of the really distinct connections that we can identify, the hummingbird, these red tubular flowers, but there's all these kind of other small pieces of the puzzle that come in. Ecosystems, ecology, living systems, they're complex, and there's a lot of things going on. Our native flora is robust. We've got about 2,500 species within the kind of broader Northeast region. They grow everywhere you could possibly think of. This pincushion plant that you see here, terrible garden plant. That thing grows on the top of Mount Washington, grows in alpine zones, grows out of like cracks in the rocks. It can handle ridiculously crazy winds and temperature fluctuations and snow and just about everything that you could throw at it in these kind of high alpine zones. We have species that'll grow absolutely everywhere. And while that one may not be a great garden plant, we have a lot of native species that are. And when you start working with these plants, you find that they really don't need much from you. You got to help them kind of get established. You'll notice I say well-sited and established native plants. But once they're established, if you're picking the right plant for the right place, you don't need to water them. You don't need to fertilize them. You don't need to mow them. They kind of take care of themselves. Yellow plume grass here, one of my favorite native clumping grasses. Will grow in the sunniest, driest, sandiest sites you could possibly think of. Will tolerate salt spray. It's a survivor. It'll handle just about anything. And look at those colors. I know when I first got into gardening, I thought, oh, grasses. Why would someone plant a grass? And then I met something like this. Vibrant orange color on the stems, these golden plumes that kind of wand in the wind. It's just a lovely plant. Maple leaf viburnum's on the other end of the spectrum. This thing will grow in the densest shade that you can think of. And not only will it grow in dense shade, it'll give you color like this in the dense shade. A lot of really colorful fall foliage plants that really don't produce a lot of color if they don't have good sun exposure. Maple leaf viburnum is one of the exceptions. Flowers well in the shade, fruits well in the shade, fall foliage in the shade. It'll also grow in full sun. It's pretty easy going. When it comes down to it, if you start working with native species, you have less to do. You don't have to take care of them nearly as much. You just kind of get them started, and then they take care of the rest for themselves. And they bring in all these other things. What we're looking at in this picture is the chrysalis of the Baltimore checker spot. Really cool native butterfly that will feed specifically only on white turtle heads, which is the little bit of leaf we see left in that picture there. So, I used to spend a lot of time in botanic gardens. I spent 10 years working at Garden in the Woods. I talked to a lot of garden clubs and a lot of gardeners, and I have yet to meet a person who got into gardening for love of mulch. And yet it is an extremely common, and I will argue very much overused part of most of our gardens. I hopped online and I just typed in garden, and I got this picture, and I got this picture, and I got this picture. We've got more mulch in these gardens than we actually have plants. I don't quite get it. For me, mulch is a very useful tool. It's extremely useful, especially in young gardens. But it's not meant to be a permanent part of the landscape. It's a tool that helps you kind of bridge that gap between new space and a mature space. But the idea of kind of adding mulch to the garden on like an every couple of year basis, constantly top dressing, complaining when it's not the right color, just not into it. You need more plants. And we can take something like this, which is a whole lot of mulch and some meatball, what are those, boxwoods and a few other kind of plants, and we can start kind of converting it to something else. So here's the game. Spot the mulch. This is not a garden. This is a picture from Norcross. You can see some building in the background. This is the north side of a greenhouse space. This area gets absolutely no direct sun. You can see the big trunk of the sugar maple, that grows above it. So we got a building and we got a big tree kind of, covering this area. And yet we've got this thriving patch of whitewood aster. To me, the whitewood aster is the mulch. It's the one that kind of fills in and covers the space for me. It's also a fantastic habitat plant. This is the Edgartown Public Library. We're now on the Cape. Again, can't see any mulch. They've done a really good job in this library. What we're looking at here is this kind of dense planting of sweet fern. And what's really nice is people will sit on this stone wall and you lean back and you get this fragrant fern that's just kind of right behind you. It's a really well done garden. It's Garden in the Woods, my old stomping ground. The mulch in here is that yellow flower. It's Stylophyrum diphyllum, the wood poppy. We would use a lot of mulch at Garden in the Woods. We were constantly building new gardens, but the mulch we were using was meant to get filled by plants in short order. So I'll go out and I'll talk to mulch salesmen, people who make their living off of selling this stuff, and I'll ask them, why are we using so much mulch? And they'll give me all these reasons. And none of these reasons are wrong. Every one of these things is true. The fact is that mulch is actually not the best thing to do for all of these things. It's a useful tool for that young garden. This garden in this picture here is a very young garden. We had just planted that at Garden in the Woods. You can see the plugs, you can see the spacing, you can see the mulch. In that case, we used kind of shredded leaf mulch. The thing is that plants just do it better. Plants will do all of the things that mulch do better than mulch does, and that's the exact same space just a year later. And when you start thinking in this manner, you realize that you want mulch that'll actually break down and allow the plants to kind of fill in. That's why we like the shredded leaf mulch. It doesn't last very long, and that's kind of the point. It breaks down quite rapidly, it feeds the soil, and then things like the Phlox divaricata you see in this picture, the Tiarella, some other great species start to just kind of fill in and take that space. For me, mulch is a temporary and useful tool, but not a long-term one. So if we start thinking about using plants kind of in place of mulch, what plants do we use? Not every plant makes a good living mulch. There's some that do it very well and some that really do not. We're looking for this balance. I want a plant that can spread rapidly enough that it kind of fills in the space, but it also needs to be a good companion. I don't want it to spread so rapidly and so vigorously that it takes over the whole area and that's all I've got. I'm looking for something that can kind of play well with others. Got something like some of our native goldenrods that spread very strongly. I like the spread, but they don't really have that companionship that I'm looking for in such, in a living mulch. And then you got things like bluets. I absolutely love bluets. Great plants, great companionship, but they really don't spread nearly vigorously enough for me to kind of use them in this manner, at least. I'll use these, in between my paving stones, but they're not going to make a particularly good living mulch. The other thing to kind of question when we're thinking about what works well for living mulch is how are these plants spreading? Some plants spread via seed. This picture is actually the same wild geranium that we talked about earlier. You can see these little candelabra seed, they're literally catapults that spread seed around. Other plants are going to spread rhizomatically, whether they be by roots or stolons or some other way that the clump is going to get larger. And I actually like a combination of both for this purpose. I find it does a very good job of really filling in nicely for me. This is one of my go-tos. When people ask me about what I like for living mulch, running foam flower is the one that pops into my head first every time. This is that perfect balance between, some level of kind of vigorous spread, but it's not one to take over a space by any means. It's very good at spreading in amongst other species. Not only do you have these cool flowers that you see on the left, but you get some really cool leaf forms that you can see on the right. That is not a cultivar, despite the fact that it looks like one. It's just a wild seed-grown one from my time at Garden in the Woods. A different horticulturist than myself might take that, stick a patent on it, and give it a name. There's plenty of cultivars out there that look like that, but we were just happy to find it. And this isn't working as living mulch. The Tiarella is really the thing filling in throughout this entire garden. And yellow lady slippers, if anyone's grown them before, this is not a plant that tolerates a lot of heavy competition. So the fact that everything is working well here is kind of the testament to, the balance between this kind of running, spreading form that is a foam flower, but also its ability to grow amongst other species, like yellow lady slipper. Something I also learned is that when you start growing this plant from seed, you start seeing this diversity of forms that just tickles me every time. I love the fact that some of them show variegation, some of them are more entire, some of them are more lobed. It's really interesting. When I used to kind of grow these in nurseries, I didn't realize that they were just clones and clones and clones and clones. They were very, very consistent. They're also all the same. And though there might be some value in consistency, if that's what you're looking for aesthetically, the challenge with that is if you get an insect outbreak or a pest outbreak or some sort of disease that affects this species, not that I know any that do, but if you were to get that, there's really no level of resistance here. If one plant is a disease and everything's cloned, then they're all affected. If you've got this diversity of different individuals on the landscape, there's a decent chance that one of them is going to be affected differently from the next. And you might find resistance emerging on your landscape. I feel like I'm the PR guy for Canada Mayflower. This is one of the most common plants in our entire region. If you're looking at oaks or pine trees, there's probably this thing growing underneath it. It's a very, very common plant. It's a rapidly spreading plant, which tends to kind of turn people off initially. But what I tend to kind of tell people is that though it spreads very rapidly, this thing roots like 1/8 of an inch into the ground. It does not root deeply. And what that means is that lots of other plants, like some that we're seeing in this picture, whether it be sedges or Solomon seal or even lycopodiums, are able to kind of root underneath it and grow in amongst it quite rapidly. This is a natural picture, but take it and put it in like a bit of a garden setting, give it a little bit of maybe a little more light or a little more nutrients than it might get in the wild, and you can get a really cool display out of this. A lot of flowers followed by a lot of red fruits. They're technically edible, not particularly good, but great for the birds and the chipmunks. And here's it showing how well it can grow amongst other species. On the left, it's growing with Coptis groenlandica, that's gold thread, that's actually a pretty uncommon species and a very slow grower. In the middle, we've got partridge berry growing underneath it. On the right side, those red leaves are the new emerging leaves of winterberry. Not winterberry, wintergreen. So what we've got are 3 different species here growing in amongst this rapidly spreading Canada Mayflower, and all 3 of these are very slow-growing plants. Don't let its rapid spread scare you off. It spreads rapidly, but it's still a very good companion plant. Running groundsel, one that I find less people are knowledgeable about. You can find it growing in wetlands around our region. That being said, though it's perfectly happy growing in wetlands, it's also perfectly adaptable to just about any garden setting you can think of. From kind of average soils into dry sites, it actually does quite well. It's got this cool purple tinges you see in the early season, and as the season starts to emerge, you get these kind of, these flowers starting to stick up, and then these bright yellow kind of cheery flowers that kick in kind of late spring, followed by a fluffy seed head that just kind of blows around in the air, and hopefully makes new free plants for you elsewhere. So, we've talked about mulch, let's talk about weeds. Because weeds are like the common gardener's tripe. Anyone who gardens deals with weeds. And the question is, where do weeds come from? This is not a philosophical question. I mean this in a physical manner. Where are they coming from? When you start thinking about it, they're coming from above. They're spreading, whether they be in the air with something like dandelion, or whether they're coming in from birds flying above who maybe have eaten a berry and poop it out in your garden. Weeds tend to come from above. We can make an argument for a weedy seed bank, but frankly, the majority of the weeds are emerging from the above ground, side of things. Which means that this is a complete waste of time, money, and frankly, a great way to pollute your landscape. This is one of the best ways to just shed microplastics into the landscape, and yet it's still a very common practice. It's also a pretty awful thing to do to those red cedars? One of the cedars. Weed fabric's awful. Don't use weed fabric. The challenge with this, it may block the seed bank that's below, but as soon as you cover that with some mulch, the weed seed is going to start coming down from above and it's going to root in. And anyone who's ever used this stuff knows that all it does is buy you maybe a season of weed-free time. And then after that, it's just a headache forever afterwards. And a lot of plastic pollution on the landscape. What I prefer to do is to cultivate my seed bank. I want the seeds that are landing on my landscape to be good plants, the sort of plants that I get excited when they emerge on their own. Things like the columbine here. And the way I do this is I work with species that are very good at seeding around the landscape, which generally means our native annuals and short-lived perennials. Think about it. If you're an annual plant and you're only going to live for 1 year, that doesn't mean you're going extinct in a year. It just means that the individual plant is only going to last a year. The way that these populations and species can last for, tens of thousands of years is they are very good at producing flowers, producing seed, getting that seed on the landscape, and the seed is very good at then growing. This way you can have annuals that will last in an area for 100 years. Partridge pea is a great example of this. I spread partridge pea in new gardens and they are there 20 years later, and those plants only last a year. 20 years later, I'm looking at the 20th generation. Columbine is a good example of this as well. So some, semi-annual to or semi-native to native annual species that I like to work with. Plains coreopsis on the left and blanket flower in the middle are kind of arguably native, depending on how you want to argue it. The argument I tend to make is that they have a lot of ecological value on the landscape, so that's good enough for me. These are native to Pennsylvania, Ohio. They're pretty close. If you want to be really solid about your nativity, the one on the right, partridge pea, is native all throughout the Northeast, everywhere from Connecticut, Maine, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. It's a fantastic species, great bee value on this one. Also has some value for some of our native ant species, which is kind of a cool thing. And it's a very easy plant to work with. This is not one that I go buying living plants. Seed is cheap and readily available. Buy yourself a bag of seed, plant out your garden any way you're going to. And the last step I do in my new gardens is I grab that bag of seed full of partridge pea and I'm just throwing it around the garden. And that's exactly what you see in this picture here on the right. That is a new garden where the partridge pea is really kind of showing up. And you'll find the first couple of years of those new gardens, it's really heavily on the annuals. And then they start to decline as our perennials start to really become competitive. After the annuals really thrive, you get these short-lived perennials. Spotted bee balm, a really lovely species of bee balm that I find less people are familiar with. This is the bee balm for the sunny, dry sites, unlike the scarlet bee balm or even the wild bergamot that I think are a little more better known. Wild columbine, a species. When I used to work in kind of, in garden crews, I would talk to a lot of folks who said, oh yeah, I love wild columbine. I planted that and it was great for a few years, and then it just disappeared. And the reason for that is these are short-lived species and they thrive with a little bit of disturbance on the landscape. So if we're mulching everything, what we're not doing is allowing these plants to kind of continue. What I often do, if I want these plants to continue, is go and rough up the soil a little bit. And in many cases, I don't actually think to do that. So I will be planting these species. And then 3, 4, 5, 8 years down the line, when I decide, you know what, I want to plant a new shrub over there, I'll go dig a hole in the garden, I'll stick the new shrub in, and the following season, that shrub is rung by spotted bee balm, wild columbine, and black-eyed Susan, because this is now my seed bank. They've been kind of waiting in the seed bank for a little bit of soil disturbance, and they're what emerges. The one on the right, Rebecca Hurd, is one of my go-tos for this. I always like this picture. I did not plant a single one of the black-eyed Susans in that picture. We had black-eyed Susans in a garden that was maybe 100 yards to the left. This is a new garden space. We did some digging. We planted things like the butterfly milkweed that you can see in that picture, yellow wild indigo, some other species, and the black-eyed Susans just emerged. And then the black-eyed Susans are what you might call your weed. And when you really like your weeds, you don't really think of them as weeds anymore. It just becomes a matter of editing. Is there a black-eyed Susan growing right where I just planted that butterfly milkweed? Maybe I'll pop that one out. But I'll leave 300 others, in their place. And this is something that really can work easily. You're just working with species that are good at kind of seeding around the landscape. Okay. This doesn't make any sense to me. I don't really get why we've decided that lawn is the norm for us. We've got a monoculture of a non-native species that needs a ton of maintenance to keep it happy, and God forbid the thing ever starts growing, we break out the mowers and we mow it down to size so it can never really develop a good root system. We're stuck in a really weird cycle here. I don't quite get it. That being said, telling everyone to replace their lawn with gardens or something else is kind of complicated. So maybe it's not that lawns go away entirely as much as we need a better version of them. I want a lawn that does not need to be watered once it's established. I want a lawn that does not need to be fertilized. I want my lawn to be an active part of the ecology of the system. I want it to be habitat. The traditional lawn is a habitat dead zone. It does not sequester carbon, not in any sort of reasonable way, and the amount of inputs that goes into it well outweighs the little bit of sequestration it does. And it does not feed wildlife, which is kind of my thing. I want my lawn to feed wildlife. And if I'm bringing wildlife to my lawn, the last thing I want is to be putting pesticides and herbicides on it. That's kind of counterintuitive to me. And then depending on your situation and what you're going to be doing with your lawn, you probably need it to tolerate at least some foot traffic. And for some folks, that might be walking across it once a day to check the mail. And for other folks, it's going to be free-range chickens and a pile of kids playing soccer on it. So that's where you kind of got to decide what works for you. Let me give you some options. And the one thing I do say that I do like about lawns is that they have potential. It's actually pretty easy to turn a lawn into something that is habitat. It's a lot harder to turn a parking lot into habitat. Lawns are not hard to kill, and they're not hard to turn into something better. And that is something we can do. But it's not for everyone. There's what I call these kind of gradients of ecology. I want you to find what works for you. I'm really not into telling you what to do. I want to provide you with the tools to make up your own mind. So there's these kind of options for you. On the top, which maybe should be the bottom, is the perfect lawn. And by perfect, I mean your kind of classic golf course lawn. Monoculture, mowed low, treated with everything, perfectly green. Those things really are a habitat dead zone. On the far other side of the kind of thing is rewilding into something that's not a lawn anymore. You're turning your lawn into a forest or a meadow or something that's probably not all that applicable to most people. It's the stuff in between where I find most people find, it really starts to work. You can start treating your lawn a little bit differently. There's things you can do to treat a traditional lawn that makes it at least a little less unsustainable. But then there's also a lot of these kind of low mow options and non-native but low kind of input lawn replacements that are a huge step in the right direction. And then there's actually native lawn alternatives, which are even a step beyond that. It can really start to build habitat in place. So for some non-native options, look at things like eco lawn. You can find eco grass, low mow lawn. They're all generally similar. They're a mix of cool season fescues, most of them non-native species, but some of them including natives. These are not by any means invasive. And what's great about them is being a cool season grass, that term can sometimes be confusing. You'll hear cool season and warm season. What it means is it's identifying the season where the growth is occurring. So cool season grass is putting on its growth during the cool season, spring and fall. Most turf grasses, like Kentucky bluegrass, which is not from Kentucky, is a warm season grass, which is why we need to mow it like once a week in the summer. It's a lot of mowing. It's a lot of carbon. It's a lot of inputs. It's a lot of cutting. Cool season grasses that put in all their growth in spring and fall can be mowed once or twice a year. They really don't put on a lot of growth during the summer. So as long as you kind of mow them towards the end of spring, maybe once again in fall, you've greatly reduced the amount of inputs you need to put into your lawn. Not only does this mean you get to do less work, but it means you're pumping less carbon into the atmosphere. These are slower growing grasses. That means they don't rely on heavy amounts of water or fertilizer. Kentucky bluegrass is a bit of a pig. It needs a lot of nutrients. Where it naturally grows is a part of the world that gets a lot more rain even than us in the Northeast and tends to have richer, more kind of alkaline soils. Think of the UK, where it is indeed a native species. So some good options for these sort of grasses. You can get Ecolawn through Prairie Moon, Ecograss through Wildflower Farm. I know Ernst Seed sells a different mix. They're not hard to find these days. This is becoming much more common and popular. Another option is something like white clover. It wasn't so long ago when white clover was a very common component of lawn mixes. But during the 80s, there was a very successful ad campaign convincing folks that white clover is a bad thing to have in their lawn. So they then sold you a bunch of herbicides to kill the white clover, and then they sold you a bunch of fertilizer to make up for the fact that you no longer have this great nitrogen fixer in your lawn. It was a very good ad campaign, but it actually is a pretty awful thing to do ecologically. White clover is not a native species, but for a non-native species, this is a pretty good plant for ecological value. There's quite a few bees that'll visit white clover. The native plants are better, but that's a pretty good option. And any of the options on the screen are a huge step up from your traditional kind of turf lawn. The downsides to them the upsides to them are time and cost, frankly. They're cheap, they're readily available, they're easy to install. You can get these installed in 1 to 2 seasons. Can be purchased as seed. Follow the instructions on the bag. They're going to have very specific instructions in terms of when to sow it, how to mow it within those first few seasons. But as long as you follow the instructions, these will work. The mixes are really good at doing their job. The disadvantage, at least compared to the native species, is a lessening of ecological value. That being said, this is a great step for a lot of folks. It's readily available, and it's a huge step ecologically up from a traditional lawn. When we start getting into the native species, though, we start taking it to the next step. This is Carex pennsylvanica. This is not a grass, despite the fact that it pretty much looks like one. It's technically a sedge. It's called the Pennsylvania sedge. It's a rhizomata species, which means it spreads quite rapidly. Well, it doesn't spread rapidly, but it spreads quite readily. And it's a native species. This native sedge that does not produce a flower, those white flowers are an aster, it's the sedge is underneath it. This does not produce an insect-pollinated flower, yet you will find up to about 30 different native caterpillars that will eat the leaves of this sedge and then turn into native butterflies and moths. This sedge is an ecological powerhouse. It provides more habitat than a lot of plants you find in your typical kind of pollinator garden lists. It's a great species to be used as a native lawn. It's also a plant that naturally grows under pines and oak trees and in kind of shady sites, so it can fill the niche where a lot of lawns fail. It'll do full sun. It'll do a traditional kind of lawn space, but it'll also grow on those shady edges where, traditional lawns tend to thin out and not do so well. Here's the downsides to it. It's slower to establish and it's more expensive to establish it. Takes about 3 to 4 years to get a sedge lawn up and running. An LP32 is pretty much, it's a 32 size plug. It's a big plug, $1.90 per plug. That's getting expensive. So for a lot of these, what I recommend is start small and kind of grow into it. There's faster options. I'll give you one in a moment. That being said, the sedge has the advantage of still looking like a traditional lawn, which really does well for some folks. This picture in the middle is a natural population of Carex pennsylvanica growing in dense shade. So you can have a lawn that looks that good in dense shade. And that one on the left there is what it can look like in full sun. And you can mow this once a year, or not at all. This is my go-to. This is my absolute favorite kind of lawn replacement. This is our native wild strawberry. This is a pretty vigorous spreader. This will fill in much more rapidly. It is also a pretty vigorous spreader. So if you've got like your prized peony garden right on the edge of the lawn, this is going to move into the peony garden. Definitely something to kind of decide if it's the right plant for you. That being said, this is an ecological powerhouse. The flowers are visited by some generalist bees. They're not the ecological powerhouse of this plant. And the berries, even themselves, are valuable and lovely for humans, but they're not the most important part of the plant. The most important plant are the leaves. The leaves are fed on by about 80 different native insects in our region. We're talking native caterpillars like the dantanas and fritillaries and a variety of species that become the native butterflies that we love to see. This plant provides more habitat than most pollinator gardens as a whole. This is kind of one of those like sleeper plants that people don't realize has got such value, not to mention the fact that we get to eat strawberries. So here's a strawberry lawn that I established. What you've got in that picture is the lawn that was just planted. Definitely not established yet. You can see some kind of brighter colored leaves. That's the new growth, and a lot of bare space in between. That's really not yet a full lawn. My first late spring, I even got a few berries. Not a lot, but it's lovely to get them in the first year. This is that exact same lawn the following spring. So you can still see a little bit of, dirt there. You can see it's not fully filled in yet, but we're getting pretty close. We've got a huge demonstration of flowers. Things are really starting to fill in nicely there. You will also get a lovely crop of berries. That second year of berries are going to be the biggest berries you'll ever see. After the second year, everything's filling in and they start competing with each other and the berries get a little bit smaller. That is that same fall. Second year fall, showing you some really lovely fall color that you can get on the wild strawberries. And at this point, you can see it's entirely filled in. Took me 2 years to get that lawn established. It has been doing perfectly fine now without any care whatsoever for the past 7 years. If you want to see this lawn, come visit me at Norcross and I'll show it to you. Another plant that I've started to work with more extensively, sometimes mixed into lawns with these other species. Some folks want like a pure species lawn. Other times you're looking for a mix. The American self-heal is a really lovely species. This is a native member of the mint family. Grows very differently from your typical kind of spearmints, peppermints. These flowers seem to be extremely valuable for some of the rarest bees in our region. It's not really fully understood yet why they seem to be so valuable. The prevailing theory is that there's something about the nectar of these plants or the pollen of these plants that helps bees to regulate their gut flora. It's kind of like eating probiotics for us. At least that's the running theory. What we do know is that when we do surveys for rare bees in this region, they will, pardon the pun, beeline straight to this species. They will fly past other plants and go to this one first. This seems to really attract some of the rarest specialists in our region, but you'll also find a ton of generalists on it. And it's a great component of kind of the lawn landscape. So that picture in the middle there, that's actually a self-heal lawn that I established. There it is right there. That's year 2 from some closely planted plugs. Usually with a little more broad planting, I say about 3 years for a self-heal lawn. Still kind of playing with this species. I actually think it does best as a component of a mixed lawn, more than the kind of full, on its own sort of setup. That being said, still kind of working with this one, figuring out what it really likes. It's also just a great garden plant, and as I mentioned, really, really valuable kind of bee habitat. So this is kind of just general list of native plants that do fantastic just about everywhere. I've got a lot of plants in my head that for very specific sites are the one to go for. These are the ones where you don't really need the specific site. If you're growing generally in the sun or generally in the shade, there's a good chance these plants are going to do well for you. Feel free to snap a picture of the screen. This is also something that I sent to the Estuary folks as a PDF. So, if you want it, reach out and we can send you a copy of this list. These are good plants. Grow them. So, wild geranium, we talked about this one earlier. This is one of my go-to plants. It's one of the ones on the list. It frankly grows just about anywhere. It'll do full sun. It'll do quite a bit of shade. It'll grow in moist sites. It'll grow in dry sites. The flowers are generally this kind of pink color, but you can find white forms without too much difficulty. Notice here we've got one of the green metallic sweat bees and a local ant hanging out. I also like this plant for its textural value. So the flower in the picture on the right is wild bleeding heart. The wild geranium is the plant underneath it with that kind of blue-green sort of tinge that you're seeing on that one and those kind of textural broad leaves. The gardener in me says, "Oh, that's an interesting texture." Even when the plant's not blooming, I'm enjoying seeing it in the garden. And I really like that when I'm thinking about kind of garden plants. I don't want something that's just going to look good when it's in flower and be boring the rest of the season. I want a plant that looks fantastic in flower and looks cool the rest of the season. And these are those seed heads that I mentioned earlier. After the flowers pass, you get these kind of seed heads that, if you look to the top of this image, there's a seed head that's got three kind of curled, pieces sticking up. But if you look at the base of it, there's one still at the bottom. So that one at the bottom is the catapult. It's the one with the spring loaded waiting to go, and there's still a seed in there. And as this fruit matures, it starts to dry down. The glue that's kind of holding that in place breaks down, and the thing flings itself up and shoots off seeds. So once you get a fruiting population of these in the garden, you start seeing new plants emerging, within about 6 feet of where the parent plants are. A great thing to have seeding around the garden. We have native spireas. I will never understand why you go to the nursery and all you find are non-native, in some cases invasive spireas, and they don't carry our native Spirea tomentosa. Oh, I got my common name wrong on this one. This one's steeplebush. Meadowsweet is the white flowering one. This is a fantastic native species. It grows anywhere from wet sites to dry sites. It's got these vibrant pink flowers. It's also a shrub that can be cut back like a perennial at any time. I incorporate this shrub into my meadows that are getting mowed or burned on an every couple of year basis, and it's perfectly fine with that. It also makes it a really good shrub to put under the, kind of foundations and drip lines. If you got a lot of snowpack that smashes it down, just cut it down to the ground. It'll come back from it, no problem. This is it growing under a power line cut. Where was I? I want to say that was Sudbury, Mass. But this is a plant that when I first kind of met it, I saw it in wetlands and I thought it needed wet soils. And then I started finding it in these super dry, fully exposed power line cuts and realized that it can grow just about anywhere. And I don't know why I included this picture. Maybe it's just because I love this plant. Everyone should be growing more of this one. It's a fantastic species. It's easygoing. It's a huge habitat plant. You'll find a bunch of butterflies visiting the flowers when they're in bloom, and some really cool caterpillars that'll eat those leaves. Forget the specifics on this one. Asters, native asters in a general sense are fantastic habitat plants. They're both great for our native Lepidoptera, the caterpillars that turn into butterflies and moths, but also for our native bees. They're one that kind of hits those two big groups really, really well. The bees are visiting the flowers, the caterpillars are eating the leaves. You'll find some butterflies on the flowers too, but it's mostly bee pollinated. They're really great species, and there's a ton of them in the region. And that's where I want to get specific. Blue wood aster, this one, Aster cordifolium, is one of the species that I recommend most often. It'll do full sun. It'll also do quite a bit of shade, and I find myself putting it on those shady edges somewhat regularly. It's one of those. You ever notice how horticulturists lie about colors? We call things blue that are really not blue. This one can sometimes give you some blue tinges, but it's really more purple, sometimes pink, sometimes white. But either way, it's a lovely species, even if we're lying about the colors. As I mentioned, really important bee habitat. Not only is it full of really valuable pollen for the bees, but it's blooming in the really late season, when bees are kind of getting ready for winter, the pretty much toughest time of year for them. Really important late season food for them. And can really put on a show when it's doing well. It's an easygoing plant. So, before I wrap it up today, I want to talk about some of the challenges on the landscape. These are the kind of common places that, years of working with folks and hearing, oh, things don't grow well here. What are those places? Full sun, thin soils. That picture, again, is from the Edgartown Public Library. If anyone isn't familiar with Martha's Vineyard, it's pretty much just a giant pile of sand right off the coast of Massachusetts. So they have a lot of sand, a lot of sun, a lot of salt spray. It's a classic place for these kind of full sun, thin soils. Great place to get inspired on what will grow in these challenging conditions. The other end of the spectrum is the New England kind of acidic forest, whether it be a pine forest, an oak forest, a hemlock forest, or a mix of them. This kind of dry acidic shade is one of these kind of challenging situations that a lot of us in the region have to deal with. Less of us working in kind of, consistently wet sites, but for those of you who are, you very well might know that there are kind of a select group of plants that grow well in these sites, and then there's a lot that do not. I'm guessing folks in this audience probably are a little more familiar with these sites than the general audience I speak with. And something that I think needs to be mentioned is these kind of cultural expectations. Because, those gardens full of mulch that I showed you pictures of, that's the cultural expectation. That's what people see. How are they supposed to know any better if they're not in this audience listening to me ramble on about it? I've got this tree saved in my image database as worst tree ever. This is a calorie pear. It's an invasive species that is one of the biggest mulch volcanoes I've ever seen. And it's pruned into a meatball. Everything about this picture is wrong. The one possible thing I can make up in my head is to say maybe the landscaper knew this was an awful plant to be planting and he was trying to kind of low-key kill it without making it obvious with that horrible mulch volcano. I think that's probably giving him more credit than it's worth, but don't plant calorie pears, don't do mulch volcanoes, and don't prune everything into meatballs. I did say I wasn't going to tell you what not to do, but maybe don't do any of that. Um, so kind of thinking about some of these challenging landscapes, I've got my kind of go-to plants. This is not all I would put in full sun thin soils, but this is the base of the garden space. And this is based off of a lot of the meadows that I manage at Norcross. Our meadows are dominated by little blue stem. They're full of gray and early goldenrod. They have things like stiff aster in them, spotted bee balm, and black-eyed Susan. And then some of them, the really cool ones, have showy aster in them, and other species as well that we start kind of adding on top of this if we need to. These are great plants that will thrive in full sun thin soils. The other end of it, the dry acidic shade. These are species that in some cases can be kind of weedy if you put them in rich sites, but give them these kind of challenging sites, and that's exactly where they thrive. Wreath goldenrod is not a weedy plant. That's actually goldenrods get a bad rap. That's a pretty well behaved one. And the bluewood aster we already talked about in the bottom left. Black cohosh is an interesting one. That's one that I've heard folks who are working in kind of richer gardens describe as a weed. That's also a plant that is legitimately rare in the natural world. I've always found it interesting that we can have plants that are kind of weedy in garden settings but are rare in the wild. Usually, when you're finding that mix, it means we're looking at habitat loss being the reason that this is now rare in the wild, not because the plant is weak for any reason. And then white wood aster, which is kind of the shorter but more vigorous cousin to the blue wood aster, and the Pennsylvania sedge that we mentioned earlier. Great species for dry acidic shade. Okay, last thing I want to do before I open it up to questions is talk about how to clean up your garden in fall, or maybe how not to. And again, what I want to do here is give you all the reasons and the tools maybe to make a change and let you decide what works for you. So why might you not do this garden cleanup that I used to spend a lot of time doing on crews and getting paid well to do it? Frankly, it's better for the plants. Especially if we get one of those kind of dry, cold winters that we get every couple of years. You notice how all the snow has landed on this blue star there? Imagine all of a sudden it's not a very snowy winter. We got just a little bit of snow that's landing on that plant. Then the sun comes out, it starts to melt, and it starts to drain down the side of that plant and lands right at the crown of the plant. Snow is actually a very, very good insulator. And we want that insulation right at the crown of the plant. The plant itself, the stems help with that as well. If you cut that all back and we get that kind of cold, windy sort of winter, then the winds are really going to kind of whip right around this thing. And if the plant is struggling because maybe we had a drought year or maybe you just planted it earlier in the season or for any other reason, that extra insulating layer, whether it be the wind block that the plant itself can kind of form or the snow that's now piling down on top of it, can be the difference between that plant making it and not. Snow is actually very good for plants. We like snow. It's also better for the birds. I will never understand why we cut back all of our gardens full of bird seed in the fall and then go to the store to buy bird seed. It doesn't make sense to me. That's wild bergamot in that picture here. That is some of the highest quality bird seed you could ever find in our region. It is loved by a variety of birds. In my landscape, the finches go nuts for it, but I've seen a variety of different species on it. And it's a plant that does very well just being left alone. And then later in the season, you get to look at birds feeding on your plant. It's better for the bees. About a third of our bees are nesting in dry stems over the winter. The rest of them are nesting in the ground over the winter. So if we're cutting back all of our gardens every fall, what we're doing is removing that bee habitat from the garden. If we're cutting our gardens back in the late fall, what we're doing is cutting back those stems that might already have bees, in them. Then we're not only removing the habitat, we're removing the bees from the garden. I don't like either of those things. Leave the stems up, let the bees hang out. It's better for the butterflies. The butterflies are frankly less consistent than the bees. Some of them, it's a rare thing in our region, but some of them will actually overwinter as an adult butterfly. Most of them are overwintering as an egg or a chrysalis or a caterpillar like the woolly bear that you can see here. And a lot of those are in the leaf litter. So if we're raking up all the leaves in the fall, putting them in the bags, having the garbage man take them away, not only are we throwing organic matter in the dump, but we're also removing the habitat from the garden. We're removing those woolly bears and the leaves that they hang out in. We're also removing the nutrients that are stored in those leaves that will break down and feed your garden. It's also better for the seedlings. If the birds don't eat every one of the seeds in that wild bergamot, then they're going to kind of start spreading around the garden. This is Black-eyed Susan. I used to dig these out of the paths that garden in the woods and stick them in pots and give them to the retail folks to sell. And if the birds eat all the seeds and then they poop in your garden, there's a pretty good chance those seeds are still in your garden. I like free plants. I don't want to have to go to the nursery and buy plants when I can get them showing up for free in my garden. Or maybe I wanted to go to the nursery and buy the plants that aren't showing up free. And that's not Black-eyed Susan, wild bergamot, columbine. These are all my free seedlings in the garden. And then it's better for us. And this is just a selfish one. It looks cool. That's thimbleweed. I took that picture in the dead of winter. If I'd cut that back in, October, I wouldn't have been able to see these cool thimble fruits starting to kind of fluff out and blowing around in the air. I like looking at this in the winter. I like not only looking at the plants, but looking at all the animals, the birds that are kind of interacting with my winter garden. And the final note here is to find the balance that works for you. I used to work on a lot of landscape crews, and that meant that I would go to a client's house and said, I want this whole garden cleaned up in fall. Some clients I would talk with and say, hey, let's talk about why you want to do that and what we might do differently. Others, that's what they wanted, that's what we did. So find what works for you. That being said, I find a little bit of knowledge in terms of the benefits of this can often go a really long way. So, with that in mind, I got 5 minutes left. Happy to take any questions that might be out there. And if anyone is interested in learning more and hearing more about these programs, check out this link. It takes you to our fall seminar series. I'll be giving another lecture sometime this fall. I can't remember what it's on. I believe it's on habitat management at Norcross, but don't quote me on it. Check the link and you'll find out for sure. Thanks again, and happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Dan. Do you see the questions, Dan, that are coming in from Rochelle Thomas?
I did see there was okay, I got a Q&A section and I see 2 questions. I'll start with those and we'll see if anything else comes up.
Perfect.
What do you think is the best replacement for Japanese Pachysandra? Oh, that's a tough one. Japanese Pachysandras. The house I live in, I inherited a lot of Japanese Pachysandra, and we've been slowly, removing it and replacing it with other things. Depends a little bit on your conditions. If you actually really like Pachysandra, we do have such a thing as a native Pachysandra. Doesn't grow anything like the Japanese one. It's kind of slow growing. It's deciduous. Has a really lovely flower though. That's called Allegheny spurge. It's Pachysandra procumbens. That being said, for traditional, Japanese Pachysandra usually growing in wooded landscapes. So I'm thinking about things like wreath goldenrod. I'm thinking about bluewood aster. I'm thinking about that foam flower that we looked at earlier. I'm thinking about barren strawberry, which is different from the wild strawberry we talked about earlier. It's a great woodland garden plant. You're kind of sky's the limit on that one. It's the removing the Japanese Pachysandra that's going to be the hard part. And I found that digging it is, my back doesn't like digging anymore. I've definitely gotten to that point of my life. I really like smothering when I can. A layer of cardboard and some thick wood chips does me a lot more favors than kind of working with a shovel and a hoe. Check out the plant list that I sent you, and you'll find a whole lot more other species as well. So from Chris, I have mixed some heirloom tomato plants in with my perennials. Would using compost from the kitchen compost pile be a good thing to do around these tomato plants, or is it better to separate vegetable plants from the flowers? It depends on how you want to do it. There's no right or wrong to this. I love the idea of mixing things like tomatoes into the gardens. It kind of depends on what your garden looks like and what you're doing. So what I would recommend is finding native species that do well with richer conditions so that you can compost your tomatoes, because that's a great thing to do for tomatoes. And there's certain native plants that if you throw compost at little blue stem, it's not going to do anything for the little blue stem. If you throw compost at something like scarlet bee balm, it's going to respond really well. It's going to give you more flowers. So working with native species that grow in these kind of richer landscapes are going to be really good companion plants for areas where you're going to be doing things like fertilizing and throwing down compost. And I really love doing that. Or you could do it the way I'm doing it at home, which is not right or wrong. It's just the way I'm doing it at home. Where I live is thin soil, so I don't want to be throwing compost everywhere. I'm growing a lot of thin soil native species that I like. So I have a separate vegetable garden where I can be throwing all of my compost, really trying to enrich that area, growing my tomatoes and my peppers and my eggplants. And it allows me to say that all the rest of the landscape stays thin, which I like, but this is the area for the tomatoes. There's no right or wrong. You can kind of do either one. I love mixing kind of veggies and kind of things into other gardens. It's just not something that I do at home. But I've worked on plenty of landscape that do, and it can go very well. Just find plants that grow in rich soils, and they'll take benefits from it. How do you start a low mow area? I started a meadow, but sumac took over. Okay, so this is like a 3 hour answer, and I don't have time for all of it, but I'll give you the quick version of it. The first thing I say is start small. If you're, say, killing your lawn and replacing it with something like a meadow, doing it all in one fell swoop is a lot of work. You can hire folks to do it out. That's a lot of money. These are still options, but it's a lot. So what I tend to recommend is start on the edge, or maybe start. There's a theory called the mother habitat theory, where you kind of find like little pool of habitat and start working out from there, instead of trying to cover it all at once. Start in the small areas that you can manage. See them starting to really go well, so it's not like, oh my God, the sumac took over my whole meadow and now I can't keep up with it. Have a little pocket meadow. A little bit of sumac in a pocket meadow, you can handle that, no problem. Once that area is in good shape, then you can start to expand from there. I find that's much more successful in the long run than trying to kind of do it all at once. Couple other quick things I'll throw at you. Starting the meadow usually involves kind of zeroing out the landscape, kind of starting from scratch. I mentioned smothering before. I really like that as a tool. Solarizing is another option. For some areas, herbicides might be an option, but decide whether that makes sense for you and how you might want to approach that. Starting small is my best option, and thin soils are your best friend for a native meadow. Thin soils, I'm talking sandy soils, low organic matter. We have so many native species that thrive in those landscapes, and the weeds that we don't want in those landscapes tend to grow much more slowly. So they're just much more easy to manage, easy to approach. I love thin soils. When I first started gardening, I was told I need to irrigate, I need to fertilize, I need to enrich my soils. Other end of the spectrum. I actually try and remove organic matter from soils when I can these days. Where is the best source to obtain native plants? I'd say go for the local source, and that kind of depends on where you live. Um, if you'd like, I could send my resources list to you estuary folks, and perhaps you can share that with others, and that'll give you a whole list of some nurseries that I really like working with. But a few that come right to mind: Wild Seed Project for seeds, up in Maine. Native Plant Trust has a kind of a basis in Framingham and South Deerfield, Massachusetts. They're great options. I buy a lot of stuff from Fedco, which is up in Maine. They work with both natives and kind of heirloom veggies and apples and things like that. Where else? I'm blanking on the name. Come on, brain. Prairie Moon Nursery is they're I want to say Ohio, so they're getting a little more Midwest, but they're a good option for a lot of species that I can't find elsewhere. I should give you my resources list, and you'll have about 30 more that I'm not remembering right now. So, Estuary, remind me to send it to you, and Gene, tell Estuary you need it. So. Tim, wondering if there is a native ground cover that could be used under and around blueberry plants instead of wood chips. There is. In fact, there's several. So one of the ones that I use somewhat extensively is wintergreen, Gaultheria procumbens. This is actually something that I just mentioned Fedco. I buy them from Fedco somewhat regularly. They've actually got a cultivated corn called Cherry's Berries. I wasn't so sure about a cultivated wintergreen, and then I tried it, and oh my God, is this a great plant? It establishes very rapidly and very readily, which is something that winterberry doesn't typically do. Sorry, wintergreen, not winterberry. I keep confusing those. Gaultheria procumbens. That's a great plant. Assuming you're growing high bush blueberries, something I do regularly is I underplant them with low bush blueberries. You clearly like blueberries. Why not, two bang for your buck? Low bush blueberry, black huckleberry, our native kind of low growing heath plants are really good options for you. Other good options would be our native sedges, like the Pennsylvania sedge that I mentioned earlier, or Canada Mayflower that I mentioned earlier. What I'm generally looking for is something that's low, that I can step on without really worrying about it, and something that can handle acidic soils that the blueberries like. Okay. I have some small wild strawberries growing in my yard. Are they likely the wild strawberry? I'd like to encourage wild strawberries on a sunny hill with thin soil. Yes, they are likely the wild strawberries. This is by no means an uncommon species in our region. If it looks like a wild strawberry, it's probably a wild strawberry. There are a few lookalikes, but the lookalikes are all less common. The wild strawberries are pretty common species. They transplant very readily. When I mentioned a moment ago about the kind of the mother habitat form, what I've done in the past is when I've got a little bit of a wild strawberry growing in my lawn and I want more of it, I just start weeding the lawn out from right around that wild strawberry. And the next season it's expanded. And then I weed a little bit more and it expands. That being said, it is also something that you can dig up and move to other areas. It'll do very well on a sunny hill with thin soil. You'll want to help it get established. Make sure to water it well for that first season so that it gets established. After establishment, it can handle anything. Feel free to cut me off if we need to, finish at any moment. But if not, I'll just keep working through these questions. For Northern New England, when do you recommend we do spring cleanup of lawns? I've heard of no-mow May, but which zone does that pertain to? Oh, this is another like 2-hour question. I wish I had more time with you folks. No-mow May is a great small step. I love no-mow May. I love the attention it's brought to things. But if we say have a lawn that might have some wildflowers in it, we don't mow, up through May. The wildflowers are flowering, the bees are visiting them, then we mow, and that habitat is now gone. So we've done a little bit, but it's not a lot. What I'd love no mow May to turn into is kill your lawn and grow a meadow May, which is a little bit more of a challenging sort of broad spectrum campaign. So again, kind of find what works for you. What I would say is instead of necessarily just no mow May of your lawn, start looking at maybe a little bit of lawn reduction and some wildflower strips on the sides. That's going to have a lot more long-lasting kind of habitat effects than simply not mowing your lawn, up until May. So for spring cleanup of lawns, kind of depends on what you need to do and why you're doing it. There is an option of just not cleaning up. There is no version of tree leaves blocking native plants from growing up. It's a myth. If that was a case, we wouldn't have plants growing in forests. So you could just leave it. That being said, if you want a more kind of formal and somewhat less unkempt look, which is a completely legitimate thing, what I do is wait for the bees to start flying around in spring. Usually we're looking for the temperature to get into the 50s on a consistent level. At that point, you can be reasonably confident that the bees have left those overwintering stems, they're out and doing their thing, and you can start going and doing your cutbacks and your cleanup, knowing that all that overwintering habitat has had its function, and you can kind of move on from there. There's the simple version. Oh, the questions keep coming. Okay. I've seen different information about leaving the stems. One says one says leave for 1 year, another source says leave for 2 years, and a third says you have to cut the stems to make an entry place more available. How long do you leave stems standing? So the reason this is challenging is they're all accurate. Different species are using the 1 year, the 2 year, the 3 years, and various things. And as I said earlier, it's hard to kind of simplify life into simple kind of concepts, and that's why it can get really complicated because none of it is wrong and yet all of it is wrong. So, first off, if you don't ever need to cut back the stems, don't cut back the stems. Just let them grow. New stems will come up around them and you don't need to think about it ever again. That doesn't work for everyone. So for everyone else, what I like to do is if you need to cut things back at like the 8 to 10 inch range if you can, 6 inches if you feel you need to go a little bit lower, and then just leave that lower stem forever. The nice thing about that is, in early spring, you're going to be seeing that 6, 8, 10 inch stem. But by the time the growing season's kicked in, that thing's completely hidden by the growing plant that is the bee balm or the phlox or whatever else you had going. And that way you don't have to really think about it. There might be some animals using it in the first year. There's going to be some other animals using it in the second year. You definitely don't need to cut the stem for the insects to find their way in. They can find their way in just fine. There are plenty of insects that will take advantage of a readily made hole. So if you do cut the stems, they're going to move in. That being said, these insects have been around for a long time. They figured out how to do things. So you don't need to cut back the stems. Hey, Russ Cohen, good to see you in the audience. For anyone who doesn't know Russ, he is a absolute gem in this region, and knows a ton about wild edibles, and sent me 2 questions in a row. Okay, Viola ceroria is a good native species to add to a lawn to help diversify it beyond grass. The flowers bloom relatively early, and I've heard popular with wild pollinators. It also spreads, so a few in your yard will usually lead to more. Okay, this isn't a question. That's just good information. He's entirely right. Viola aureoria, probably the most common violet in our region. Fantastic habitat plant. Specifically, regal fritillaries rely on it extensively, but a lot of other animals that rely on it. It makes a great addition to lawns, gardens. I've even seen entire lawns dominated by violets. It's absolutely fantastic. He also mentions Grow Native Massachusetts, which is a great resource. Definitely check out Grow Native Massachusetts. Hey, Linda's in the audience too. There's good folks in this audience. Thanks for thanking me, Linda. Great to hear from you. And I'm getting the sense we need to end this. Does that sound about right?
Sounds great, Dan. Thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation you had. I'm going to go right out and plant some native plants because there's good reasons for it.
Fantastic.
Great job, Dan. I want to thank the Phoebe Griffin Noyes Library, the Old Lyme Conservation Commission, and Estuary Magazine for hosting this event. Look for us in October, where we have Steve Gephardt giving a presentation on aquatic habitats. Thank you all for joining. Thanks for all the great questions. Thanks for the great content. It was very inspirational, and look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thank you so much. Have a great night, everyone.
Bye now.